In a quiet town, where life was normal and everyone knew each other, strange things began to happen. One morning, Ben, the local postman, finds several letters in his bag that he doesn't think were there before. The envelopes looked old, slightly yellowed, and addressed to different people in the town. Even stranger, they were handwritten by people who had long since disappeared or died. The postman, hesitating, still delivers these letters to the addresses indicated. Mrs. Grace, an elderly widow, receives a letter from her husband Henry, who disappeared at sea more than 20 years ago. The letter is written in his recognizable handwriting and contains personal details that no one else could know. In it, Henry asks her to leave an old compass, which was once his lucky charm, on the shore of a local lake. The compass still sits on her bedroom shelf, and the request makes her anxious. Why does he need it now? She asks herself. Another man, Jason, receives a letter from his younger brother Tom, who disappeared as a child while playing in the woods. The letter urges him to dig up a box buried behind an old church. The letter even specifies the exact location. At first, Jason takes it as a cruel joke, but Tom's handwriting is something he would never confuse. His mixed emotions, sadness, anger, and fear do not let him rest. The letters appear in different parts of the city. All of them are addressed to those who have unresolved issues with their past. At first, people perceive these letters as a strange coincidence or a prank. A few residents fulfill the requests in the letters, considering it nothing more than a strange game. However, even these first steps cause strange changes in the town. Mrs. Grace, having left her compass by the lake, sees a figure in a nautical uniform standing by the shore the next morning. Her heart sinks. It is Henry's silhouette. But as soon as she tries to get closer, the figure disappears, leaving a boot print in the sand that she immediately recognizes. Jason, digging up a box behind the church, finds an old toy car that he and his brother made together. But in the air outside the church, he begins to think he hears his brother's familiar laughter. Those who ignore the letters begin to disappear. At first, they were random people whom few people knew about. But when a young teacher at the local school, who is respected by everyone, doesn't come home, it attracts the attention of the community. She received a letter from her grandmother, who had died many years earlier, asking her to visit their old home. The teacher ignored the request, and a few days later she was found on the edge of town in a state of deep shock, unable to speak. Rumors of letters from the past spread quickly. People start talking about curses, about the connection between the letters and strange disappearances. Some believe that the letters have a sinister purpose, while others see them as an opportunity to solve old mysteries. Tension builds in the town. Everyone who receives the letters feels fear and anxiety. At the same time, these messages make them feel strangely guilty, as if they have to fulfill the request for the sake of their loved ones. The local priest, Father Caleb, tries to understand the situation. He collects several letters that residents have brought to him, hoping to get protection. The letters, he notices, are written in different handwritings, but all contain similar elements: a request for a certain action to take place in a certain place. He begins to analyze them, but one evening, when he is alone, he hears the letters whispering. The whispering fills the room, and the father feels a heavy chill in the air. The postman, Ben, who at first did not attach any importance to the letters, begins to remember how they appeared in his bag. The morning he found them, there was a thick fog in the city, although this was rare in summer. He recalls how the fog seemed almost alive, wrapping around his house and stretching along the streets as if it were looking for someone. Since then, Ben has started seeing shadows in his apartment and feeling like someone is standing behind him when he is alone. As the number of letters increases, the situation in the town becomes critical. People are afraid to leave their homes, but at the same time, each new letter makes them want to read it. The words in the letters seem to enchant them, forcing them to act against their will. Some people feel relieved after the request is fulfilled, but their eyes become empty, as if a part of their soul has disappeared with the letter. One family who received a letter from their deceased grandfather went to the place indicated in the letter, an old, long-abandoned house on the edge of town. There they found an old portrait that their grandfather had asked to be moved to a local museum. But after that, their house was filled with strange sounds. Doors closed by themselves, mirrors fogged up, leaving traces of invisible hands. They left the town, but the ghosts seemed to follow them. The town is filled with fear. The letters no longer seem like mere coincidences. They become part of something bigger, more sinister and inexplicable. And although the residents try to resist, they feel that an invisible force has already consumed their lives. Everyone who has not yet received the letter is afraid that it is about to appear in their mailbox. When the residents began to fulfill the requests in the letters, the town found itself in a whirlwind of strange and unexplained events. Every time someone completed a task, there were consequences that defied logic. Everyone felt that the letters carried something more than just a request. They opened the door to something sinister. Mrs. Grace, after leaving the compass by the lake, could no longer ignore what she saw. The silhouette of her husband Henry, who she thought was standing on the shore, appeared several more times. She even heard him calling her name, but his voice was distant, as if from another world. When she tried to answer, the lake quieted down, and the fog fell over the water, as if protecting her from something invisible. Jason, having found the toy car behind the old church, tried to put this discovery behind him. But the laughter he heard that day began to haunt him. First it came in his dreams, then it appeared in the mirrors of his apartment. One day, he woke up in the middle of the night to find his typewriter on his bed, even though he was sure he had left it in the shed. Residents who received the letters and fulfilled the requests began to notice that ordinary objects in their homes were behaving strangely. Mirrors were fogging up, leaving words written on them. The walls were cracking as if someone was walking behind them. The worst part was that these phenomena did not stop even when the tasks were completed. On the contrary, they became stronger. The priest, Father Caleb, became increasingly suspicious that the letters were connected to something otherworldly. He decided to hold a mass to cleanse the city and invited everyone who had received the letters to bring them to church. However, when he started the service, all the candles in the church went out, and the heavy oak doors suddenly slammed shut. The congregation heard whispering coming from the corners and felt the temperature drop so low that their breath turned to steam. Father Caleb felt his strength leave him and realized that this moment was only the beginning of something much worse. Cases of disappearances became more frequent in the city. People who ignored letters or failed to fulfill requests simply disappeared without a trace. Their houses were left unlocked, and the things in their rooms looked as if they had just left. In the center of each house, they found an envelope with only one word on it: lake. Meanwhile, those who completed the task received a second letter. It contained gratitude, but also a new request. The letters became more and more mysterious and complex. In some cases, the requests made people go to places that did not exist on the city map. Other letters demanded that they find things that never seemed to exist in reality, such as photographs taken in an abandoned factory or a key to a door they had never seen before. Mrs. Grace received a second letter that said, "Bring what I left in the garage." Asterisk, but her house never had a garage. She spent days searching for something that might fit that description until she finally found an old, dilapidated shed at a neighbor's house. Inside, she found a package wrapped in yellowed paper with the words, "For you, Grace." Jason received a new letter, which referred to a place in the woods where he and his brother had played as children. When he got there, he found a wooden figure that he and his brother had carved together. A new message had been carved into the figure: "Act fast." Jason felt that each new request was pulling him deeper into something from which there was no escape. The letters kept coming, even from people who had moved out of town to avoid the strange events. They would find envelopes in their new homes, sometimes just under the door, sometimes inside rooms, even though they were sure they had closed all the doors and windows. There was a growing sense in the city that something invisible and powerful was controlling all these events. The letters became not only mysterious, but also demanding. Those who did not fulfill the tasks did not simply disappear. Sometimes they were found, but no longer human. Their faces looked frozen in a grimace of horror, and their bodies turned into an empty shell that seemed to be devoid of a soul. The priest, Father Caleb, decided to investigate where the letters were coming from. He gathered a group of volunteers and started looking for the source. But every attempt to find who or what was behind it ended in failure. The letters continued to appear as if from nowhere, forcing people to follow their orders. The townspeople no longer slept well. In the darkness, they heard whispers and saw shadows moving on their own. Houses became traps, and letters became sentences that could not be ignored. The city began to plunge into fear and chaos, but everyone realized that this was only the beginning. The town was in a state of deep fear. The letters came more and more often, and their demands became more and more unclear and dangerous. With each new task, it became clear that these were not just random requests, but part of a larger plan that was unfolding beyond human understanding. Jason received another letter asking him to visit an old mine on the outskirts of the city. The mine had long been closed due to a cave-in, but the letter stated that he was to find a metal box in its depths. It seemed like an impossible task, but Jason felt he couldn't help but go. His fear gradually turned into a strange feeling of submission, as if someone else was controlling his will. When he entered the mine, the air was heavy and humid. His every step echoed in the darkness. In the heart of the mine, he found a box covered with dust and cobwebs. When he opened it, he saw inside an old photograph of himself and his brother, taken the day his brother disappeared. On the back was written, "You couldn't save me then. Can you do it now?" As soon as he read the inscription, the mine was filled with an eerie sound, a high, piercing whisper coming from all directions. The darkness began to move, creating silhouettes that looked like human figures. They slowly approached, and Jason heard them repeating his name. He ran out of the mine, but even outside he felt like the darkness was following him. He heard familiar laughter, but saw no one. The photo he held in his hand became cold as ice and made him shiver. Other residents of the town also faced new horrors. Mrs. Grace received a letter saying that she had to destroy a compass she had left by the lake. However, when she tried to find it, the compass was gone. Instead, she saw the figure of her husband standing in the water. He was not moving, but his eyes were glowing with an eerie pale green light. She tried to scream, but her voice got stuck in her throat as the water began to move, creating waves that approached her despite the complete calm. Those who did not fulfill their assignments no longer simply disappeared. They were found in their homes, but they were no longer themselves. Their bodies became immobile, their eyes froze in a look of horror, and their skin turned gray, as if life had left them. Some witnesses claimed to have seen human-like shadows emerge from their bodies and disappear into thin air. Father Caleb decided that it was necessary to find the source of these letters. He turned to the city's archives to learn more about the events that could explain this horror. In the old newspapers, he found an article about an event that happened 50 years ago. 12 people disappeared in the city, and their bodies were never found. The disappearances were accompanied by similar letters, but at the time no one understood what they meant. Further research led Caleb to the name of a man named Nicholas Harper, the only survivor of those times. He was called a madman because he spoke of voices from the past that forced people to do their bidding. Father went to Harper's old house, which stood on the outskirts of town. The house had been abandoned for a long time, but when he went inside, it seemed to him that the building was alive. The walls were breathing, and soft sounds like a child's crying came from the corners. In the room where he believed Harper lived, Caleb found an old diary. It described how Nicholas tried to fight the voices, but eventually gave up. The final entry read, "They're not leaving me. They want to come back, and now they will use others." As soon as Caleb closed the diary, the house began to move. Shadows appeared from the walls, forming the faces of people screaming silently. Caleb felt the cold creep into his bones. He ran out of the house, but in the window he saw Harper's face watching him with a grim expression. Caleb realized that the letters were a trap. They weren't just giving assignments, they were connected to something bigger and darker. He decided to gather the residents to tell them the truth. But that night, when he returned to the church, there was a letter in his room. He knew what it meant, but he opened the envelope. There was one word in it: be silent. Caleb lay awake all night, feeling the shadows in his room move, even though he was alone. He heard whispers that grew louder and felt invisible hands touching his shoulder. The next day he disappeared, leaving behind only that letter. The town's remaining residents gathered in the local town hall. The letters had become too frequent, and the disappearances too gruesome to ignore. Some whispered about curses, others blamed Father Caleb, who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. But everyone felt that something invisible and powerful was approaching its end. Jason, who couldn't get rid of the photo from the mind, decided to act. He gathered the other people who had completed the letter assignments and suggested that together they find the source of this horror. The photo, he discovered, had one more detail. It had a barely visible symbol on the back. The same symbol that Father Caleb had described in his notes about Nicholas Harper's house. The group set out for the old house on the outskirts of town. The road was gloomy. The fog that had covered the city was getting thicker, and the air was getting heavier. When they reached the house, its appearance made many people stop. The house seemed to be changing, getting bigger than it had been before, and its windows glowed with a pale green light. Upon entering, they felt the door close behind them. The darkness inside was almost impenetrable, and only faint flashes of light from flashlights allowed them to see the rooms. There were still Harper's inscriptions on the walls, but now they were changing right before their eyes. Words appeared and disappeared, forming new messages. They are coming back. In the center of the house was a room that Harper called the heart of the curse. It was a library with an old desk on which lay letters that had not yet been sent. Jason picked up one of them. It was addressed to him, although he had never seen him. The letter said, **, bring what you found and leave it here. **, he realized that it was about the photo from the mine. When he put the photo on the table, the room came to life. The walls began to move as if they were breathing, and a low hum appeared in the air. Figures began to emerge from the darkness. They were the ghosts of the people who had disappeared earlier, their faces contorted in grimaces of pain and fear. They spoke, but their voices sounded as if they were coming from another world. You helped them come back. The residents realized that their actions with the letters had only strengthened what lived in the house. The ghosts that appeared were only part of that power. From the depths of the library came a shadow, huge and pitch black, with eyes that glowed red. It spoke without words, its presence making the air tremble. "We opened the door for them," one of the residents said, his voice fading into a whisper that filled the room. Jason realized that the photograph was the key to all of this. He grabbed it and threw it into the fire burning in the fireplace. The shadow twisted, and the house began to shake. The walls cracked and the floor split, revealing a black abyss. The group rushed to the exit. The door was heavy, as if the house was trying to hold them in. When they ran outside, the house collapsed, leaving only a pile of rubble. But even outside, they could feel something watching them. When all was quiet, Jason found another letter in his pocket. It said, "This is only the beginning." After the building collapsed, it seemed that everything was over. The ruins were silent, and the town was quiet, like after a long storm. People returned to their homes, trying to find peace, but fear remained in their hearts. Jason couldn't forget the red eyes of the shadow looking at him from the depths of the house. He felt that this was not the end. The first night after the house was destroyed, Jason woke up to a strange sound. It was the soft rustling of paper. In the semi-darkness of his room, he saw an envelope falling from his nightstand. The letter was clean and white, but there was no address on it. He opened it with trembling hands and read, "You opened the door. We will be back." The town began to slowly recover, but the strange events did not stop. People started receiving letters again, even though the house was destroyed. The letters came even to those who had never received them before. Their content became more ominous. Asterisk, "You are next." Asterisk, the words seemed to be written in blood, and the smell of the envelopes was putrid. Jason decided to leave the city. He packed his belongings and moved far away from this place. But even in his new place, he did not find peace. A few days after moving in, the letter appeared again in his new apartment. It had only one word on it, home. Meanwhile, in the town, people noticed that their reflections in mirrors were changing. They saw not themselves, but figures appearing behind them. The shadows in the corners of the rooms grew thicker, and whispers could be heard even in the midst of silence. The ruins of the house remained untouched, but no one dared to come closer. One day, a group of teenagers decided to sneak into the ruins at night. They found an old table and another photo among the rubble. It depicted all the townspeople, but every face was blurred, except for one, Jason's. That same evening, one of the teenagers disappeared and could not be found. Only in the morning, an envelope with his name on it was found in the place where he was last seen. Jason, who learned about it, realized that the shadows would not let him go, no matter where he was. He decided to return to the city to finish what he had started. Once again, he found himself among the ruins and noticed that they looked even more ominous. Among the rubble was Nicholas Harper's diary, which had miraculously survived the collapse. The diary read, "Asterisk, there is no end. We are part of a cycle." Feeling that he had nothing to lose, Jason burned the diary in the remains of the fireplace. The flames burned brighter than he had expected, and shadows emerged from them, disappearing one by one. But along with them, Jason felt something pulling him into the darkness. He heard voices whispering, "Asterisk, you have become our guide." When the townspeople found the ruins the next day, they found no trace of Jason, but everyone felt that his presence remained in the ruins. The letters stopped appearing, but the shadows in the houses sometimes seemed thicker than before. And among the rubble, a house rose again, and the door to it was open.